Did she fall in love with a man who couldn't afford dinner, or did she fall in love with a lie worth $3 billion? The rain came down in sheets that November evening, turning the Chicago streets into rivers of neon and shadow. Inside a cramped, 24-hour diner on the corner of State and Madison, a man sat alone in a booth near the back, his jacket soaked through, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee he'd been nursing for an hour. The waitress had given him that look twice already, the one that said his time was running out, unless he ordered something else. He had exactly $7 in his wallet. Well, that's what anyone watching would have thought. His name was Marcus Chen, and at that exact moment, 3,000 miles away in Manhattan, his signature was worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The watch he'd left in a safe deposit box that morning cost more than the entire building he was sitting in. But none of that mattered right now, because sitting 3 booths ahead of him, sketching something in a worn notebook, was a woman who made him forget about all of it. She'd been there when he walked in, already settled into her corner spot like she owned it. Dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, paint stains on her fingers, an oversized sweater that had seen better days. She was so focused on whatever she was drawing that she hadn't looked up once. Not even when the drunk businessman stumbled in shouting about his ex-wife. Not even when the couple near the window started arguing loud enough to turn heads. There was something magnetic about that kind of focus, that kind of presence. Marcus had spent the last decade surrounded by people who performed their lives for an audience of shareholders and socialites. This woman in the diner looked like she didn't even know those worlds existed. The waitress appeared at his booth again, order pad in hand, eyebrow raised. Marcus glanced at the menu, doing mental math he hadn't had to do since college. A burger would leave him with $2. Fries would clean him out. He went with the burger, and when the waitress walked away, he caught the woman at the front booth watching him. Just for a second. Then her eyes dropped back to her notebook, but something had shifted in the air between them. This wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus had come to Chicago to disappear, to spend 2 weeks living like someone ordinary, before returning to the machine of board meetings and investment calls, and the suffocating weight of expectations. His therapist had suggested it after the 3rd panic attack in his office, after he'd admitted that he couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him and seen Marcus instead of his net worth. So he'd left his phone with his assistant, withdrawn cash, and bought a one-way ticket to a city where nobody knew his face. The rules were simple. No credit cards, no connections, no safety net. Just him and whatever he could carry. The burger arrived, and Marcus ate it slowly, making it last. Across the diner, the woman closed her notebook and signaled for her check. She counted out bills carefully, leaving them on the table with exact change. No tip, he noticed. Not because she didn't want to, but because she couldn't afford to. He recognized that arithmetic, the way she'd hesitated before putting down the last dollar. He'd seen his mother do the same thing 20 years ago, back when $7 meant the difference between dinner and hunger. The woman stood to leave, gathering her things, and that's when it happened. Her bag caught on the edge of the booth, spilling its contents across the floor in a cascade of pencils, receipts, and crumpled papers. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to collect everything, and without thinking, Marcus was out of his booth and crouching beside her. "Here," he said, handing her a handful of colored pencils. "Thanks." Her voice was quieter than he expected, tired in a way that went bone deep. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she shoved things back into her bag. She wasn't just tired. She was exhausted in the way people get when they've been running on empty for too long. A small rectangular card had slid under the table, and Marcus reached for it. A business card, if you could call it that, hand-drawn, printed on cheap cardstock. Emma Torres, it read, portrait artist, custom commissions. Below that, a phone number and an email address with a domain that probably cost $12 a year. "You're an artist," Marcus said, holding out the card. Emma took it, something defensive flashing across her face. Yeah, I try to be. She stood up, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Thanks for the help. She was leaving, and Marcus felt the moment slipping away like water through his fingers. What were you drawing? The question came out before he could stop it. Emma paused, studying him with eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted them to. Why do you want to know? I don't know, you just looked really focused, like whatever it was mattered. Something in her expression softened just slightly. It's a commission. Portrait of someone's grandmother from an old photograph. Pays $200, which is pretty much my rent this month. She said it matter-of-factly, without shame or self-pity, just the plain economics of survival. $200. Marcus spent more than that on single bottles of wine he never finished. That's good, he said, because what else could he say? That you can do that. Make something that matters to someone. Emma tilted her head, really looking at him now. You're soaked, she observed, and you've been sitting here for a while. Yeah. Marcus managed a self-deprecating smile. Got caught in the rain, still figuring out my next move. The diner door opened, letting in a gust of cold November wind and the sound of traffic on wet pavement. Emma adjusted her bag, and Marcus was certain she was about to walk out of his life forever. But then she did something unexpected. She hesitated. There's a poetry reading at a coffee shop 2 blocks from here, she said, the words coming out fast like she might regret them. Open mic night. It's warm, it's free, and they don't kick you out if you just order a black coffee. If you need somewhere to go for a while. Marcus looked at her, this woman who'd just met him, who had every reason to walk away and never look back, who was offering him kindness despite having so little to spare. And he realized that for the first time in longer than he could remember, someone was seeing him exactly as he was right now, just a soaked stranger in a diner who looked like he needed somewhere to be. I'd like that, he said. Emma nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Okay, come on then, but I'm warning you, the poetry's usually pretty bad. They walked out into the rain together, 2 people who had no idea that this moment, this simple decision made in a grimy diner in Chicago, was about to change everything. Because Marcus Chen had 3 billion reasons to walk away, and Emma Torres was about to give him 1 reason to stay. The only question was, what would happen when she discovered that the broke stranger she'd befriended could buy every building on the block without checking his bank balance? But that revelation was still ahead of them, waiting in the wings like an actor preparing to walk on stage and deliver the line that changes the entire play. Retry TM. The coffee shop was called The Lantern, a name that seemed almost too perfect for a place that glowed like a small beacon against the November darkness. Inside, mismatched furniture crowded around tiny tables, and the air smelled like roasted beans and old books. A makeshift stage occupied one corner, really just a cleared space with a stool and a microphone that crackled with feedback every few minutes. 20, maybe 30 people filled the room, most of them young, all of them wearing that particular brand of earnestness that comes with believing art might actually save you. Marcus and Emma found 2 seats near the back, their jackets dripping onto the worn hardwood floor. She ordered a coffee, black like she'd promised, and Marcus did the same, paying with his dwindling cash and trying not to think about how many coffee shops he actually owned shares in. 3, if memory served. None of them looked like this. Fair warning, Emma said, wrapping her hands around the chipped mug. Tuesday nights here can get weird. Last week, someone performed an interpretive dance about capitalism while their friend played the kazoo. Marcus laughed, and it felt strange, that sound coming from his chest. Real laughter, not the practiced corporate chuckle he'd perfected for cocktail parties. How was it? Surprisingly compelling, actually. The kazoo really tied it together. Emma's smile reached her eyes this time, and Marcus noticed the way the dim lighting softened the exhaustion in her face, made her look younger, less burdened. What about you? You from Chicago? The question landed like a stone in still water. Marcus had prepared for this, had his story ready. No, just visiting, needed a change of scenery. Not exactly a lie, not exactly the truth either. You? Born and raised, South Side. My parents still live in the same house they bought 30 years ago. She said it with a mix of pride and something else, maybe frustration, maybe love. I went to art school on scholarships, thought I'd move to New York after graduation, but then my dad got sick and plans change, you know. Sometimes the life you end up with looks nothing like the one you drew in your notebook. Marcus did know, though probably not in the way she meant. He'd drawn a different life once too, back when he was working 2 jobs to put himself through Stanford, back when success meant having enough money to take his mother out to dinner somewhere nice. Then his first company sold for $800 million, and suddenly success meant something else entirely. Something that required armed drivers and quarterly earnings calls, and forgetting what it felt like to walk through rain without an umbrella. On stage, a girl with green hair stepped up to the microphone and began reading a poem about her grandmother's hands. Her voice shook, but she pushed through, and Marcus found himself actually listening, actually moved by the simple honesty of it. When she finished, the applause was genuine and warm, the kind of recognition that had nothing to do with money or influence and everything to do with one human acknowledging another's courage. "She's good," Marcus said. "She is," Emma agreed. "That's the thing about this place. Sometimes you find something real here, something that isn't trying to be anything other than what it is." She looked at him then, direct and unguarded. "So what are you really doing in Chicago, Marcus? And don't tell me you're just visiting. People who are just visiting don't end up in diners at midnight looking like their world fell apart." The observation was too sharp, too accurate. Marcus felt exposed under that gaze, like she could see straight through the careful fiction he'd constructed. "Maybe I'm trying to remember something," he said slowly, choosing each word. "Maybe I'm trying to figure out if the person I used to be is still in there somewhere, or if I've turned into someone I don't recognize anymore." Emma didn't laugh or dismiss it. She just nodded, like what he'd said made perfect sense. "I get that. Sometimes I look at my life and wonder when I stopped being an artist and became someone who does art to pay rent. Like there's a difference, you know, between creating because you have to and creating because you need to make $400 by Friday or your landlord starts calling. Is that why you were in the diner, working on the commission? Yeah. Can't afford to heat my apartment during the day, so I work in public spaces, diners, libraries, anywhere with free Wi-Fi and outlets." She said it without self-pity, just stating facts. "What about you? What did you do before you came here to find yourself?" Marcus hesitated. This was the moment where most people would lie, would invent some mundane career that explained their presence without raising questions. But sitting there in the lantern, watching poets bare their souls for applause and coffee, lying felt like a violence against something fragile and important. "I worked in tech," he said, which was true in the way that saying the sun is warm is true, accurate but catastrophically incomplete. "Made some money, lost myself in the process." "Tech?" Emma wrinkled her nose. "Like apps and stuff?" "Yeah, something like that. My ex was in tech, software engineer. He was always talking about disruption and user acquisition and other things that made my brain hurt. We broke up because he couldn't understand why I wouldn't just get a real job." She made air quotes around the last 2 words, as if making art isn't real, as if the only things that matter are the things that scale. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He'd said similar things in different words to different people, had made decisions based on those exact principles: scalability, growth, market disruption. When had those concepts become more real to him than the look on someone's face when they saw their grandmother's portrait rendered in graphite and love? Another poet took the stage, this one older, reading something about lost chances and roads not taken. The words washed over Marcus, mixing with the coffee shop sounds and the rain against the windows and Emma's presence beside him. For 2 hours, they sat there, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. When the open mic ended and the lanterns started closing, they walked out into a city that had transformed. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and gleaming under the streetlights. Chicago stretched out around them, vast and indifferent, and somehow intimate at the same time. "Thanks for inviting me," Marcus said. "I needed that more than I realized." Emma smiled, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold. "Sometimes we all need to remember we're not alone in the struggle, right? That there are other people out here trying to figure it out too." She paused at the corner where their paths would split. "Where are you staying?" Another dangerous question. Marcus had checked into a hostel earlier, his first time ever in shared accommodation, an experience that had been both humbling and oddly comforting. "Youth hostel on Clark Street." "Fancy," Emma laughed. "Well, there's a farmer's market on Saturday mornings at Lincoln Park. If you're still in town, I'll be there. I help a friend with his stall sometimes in exchange for vegetables. Best people watching in the city." "I might stop by," Marcus said, knowing already that he would, knowing that whatever plan he'd had for these 2 weeks of anonymity had just been completely derailed by a woman with paint-stained fingers and exhaustion in her eyes. They parted ways, and Marcus walked back to his hostel through the quiet streets, his mind spinning. Back in his bunk, a thin mattress in a room he shared with 5 strangers, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and thinking about portraits that paid rent and coffee shops where honesty was currency and what it meant to be seen. Over the next few days, they fell into an accidental routine. Marcus would find Emma in her various working locations: the diner, a library branch on the north side, a laundromat where she could sketch while her clothes dried. He'd buy coffee or split a sandwich, carefully managing his limited cash while she worked on her commissions. She told him about her parents, about growing up with a father who drove a bus and a mother who cleaned houses and still somehow found money for her art supplies. She told him about her dreams of having a real studio someday, a space with good light where she could create without constantly calculating the cost of every pencil stroke. And Marcus told her carefully curated truths about growing up poor, which was real, about his mother who'd worked 3 jobs, which was real, about feeling disconnected from a life that looked successful from the outside, which was painfully, devastatingly real. He just left out the part about the private jets and the penthouse and the fact that he could solve every problem she had with a single phone call. Saturday came, and Marcus met Emma at the farmer's market as promised. She was helping at a vegetable stall, her cheeks pink from the cold, laughing with customers as she bagged organic carrots and heirloom tomatoes. Watching her, Marcus felt something shift in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Hey, broke stranger," she called out when she spotted him. "Come help me with these squash." He spent the morning working beside her, learning the names of vegetables he'd never cooked, meeting vendors who'd been farming for generations, existing in a world so far removed from his real life that it felt like a different planet. And maybe that's what it was. A parallel universe where he was just Marcus, someone who helped at farmers' markets and drank cheap coffee and could fall for a woman without his bank account being part of the equation. They had lunch at a taco truck, sitting on a bench overlooking the lake. Emma bought, insisting with a firmness that suggested arguing would be pointless. "You're running low on cash," she said simply. "I can see it in the way you count your bills. Besides, you helped this morning. Fair trade." Marcus bit into his taco, overwhelmed by the casual generosity of it, by what 2 tacos meant in her economy versus his. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in ways she couldn't possibly understand. "So how long are you staying in Chicago?" Emma asked, watching seagulls wheel against the gray sky. I haven't decided yet. Another truth that was also a lie. He had a flight back to San Francisco in 8 days. He had a company that needed him, shareholders who expected him, a life that was waiting like a trap with velvet lining. But sitting here with Emma, watching the lake and eating tacos, that life felt like a story someone had told him about a stranger. Emma leaned back, studying him with that unsettling perception of hers. You're hiding from something, aren't you? Or running toward something? I can't quite figure out which. Maybe both, Marcus admitted. Maybe I'm trying to figure out if there's a version of my life that doesn't feel like slowly drowning in success. That's a weird problem to have. I know. But I get it, Emma said quietly. Sometimes the things we think we want turn out to be prisons made of gold. She stood, brushing crumbs off her jeans. Come on, I want to show you something. She led him through the city, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every shortcut and secret path. They ended up in a neighborhood Marcus didn't recognize, stopping in front of a building that had clearly seen better days. The facade was crumbling, windows boarded up, graffiti covering every available surface. This was going to be my studio, Emma said, staring up at it. The owner promised to renovate it, rent it to artists cheap. I saved for 2 years for the deposit. Then he sold the whole building to a developer, and now it's going to be luxury condos. Story of this city, right? Everything that makes it real gets bought up and turned into something sterile and expensive for people who'll never actually live here. Not really. Marcus looked at the building, at Emma's face, at the casual cruelty of economics that he'd benefited from his entire adult life. He thought about his investment portfolio, about the real estate holdings, about how many buildings like this he'd probably helped convert into exactly what Emma was describing. The distance between who he was pretending to be and who he actually was suddenly felt like a chasm he couldn't cross. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt catastrophically inadequate. It's not your fault. Emma shrugged, but he could see the loss in her eyes. Just how the world works, right? People with money make the rules, and the rest of us adapt or disappear. And there it was, the truth that sat between them like a bomb waiting to detonate. Marcus opened his mouth, almost ready to tell her everything, to blow up this fragile thing they'd built over tacos and coffee shop poetry. But then Emma's phone rang, and she answered it, and her whole face transformed. Dad? Slow down, what's wrong? What's... Marcus watched the color drain from her face, watched her hand start to shake. When she hung up, her voice was hollow. My father collapsed at work. They're taking him to county hospital. She looked at Marcus like she'd forgotten he was there, like she was seeing him from very far away. I have to go. Let me come with you, Marcus said. But Emma was already walking, almost running, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely. He followed, and they caught a bus that crawled through afternoon traffic while Emma stared out the window, her reflection ghost pale in the glass. At the hospital, everything became a blur of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell and the particular silence that lives in waiting rooms where people prepare for the worst news of their lives. Retry TM. Emma sat rigid in a plastic chair, her hands gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Marcus sat beside her, feeling utterly useless, his presence a question mark in someone else's emergency. Around them, the county hospital waiting room hummed with its own desperate rhythms, crying children, whispered prayers in Spanish, an elderly man coughing into his fist, while his daughter rubbed his back in small, helpless circles. A doctor appeared eventually, clipboard in hand, face professionally neutral in the way that could mean anything or nothing. Emma stood so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. Marcus watched her listen, watched her whole body sag with relief that was undercut by something else. The doctor's mouth kept moving, and with each word, Emma's relief transformed into something heavier, more complicated. When the doctor left, Emma sank back into her chair. "He's stable," she said, her voice threadbare. "Heart attack, but they caught it in time. They want to keep him for observation, maybe do a procedure." She stopped, swallowing hard. "They're asking about insurance. His coverage through the transit authority is okay, but not great. The cardiologist they want him to see isn't in network. The procedure alone could be $20,000 out of pocket, maybe more." Marcus felt his entire body tense. $20,000. An amount that would barely register in his checking account that he'd spent on watches and wine and things he couldn't even remember buying. An amount that was clearly devastating to the woman sitting beside him, whose father drove a bus and whose daughter paid rent by drawing portraits for $200 at a time. "Emma," he started, but she cut him off. "I'll figure it out. I always figure it out." But her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. "I just need to think. Maybe I can sell some equipment, my laptop maybe, or take on more commissions, work overnight. There's this portrait company downtown. They do those mall kiosk things. Probably terrible work, but it pays hourly." Marcus watched her do the math, watched her trying to calculate her way out of catastrophe using tools that would never be adequate for the job. And he realized with stunning clarity that he could end this suffering with a single sentence. 5 words. "I'll take care of it." He could write a check right now, could make this problem disappear like it had never existed. He'd done it before, for charities, for causes, for strangers he'd never met. Why not for someone who'd shown him kindness, who'd reminded him what it felt like to be human? But 5 words would become questions. Where did you get that money? Who are you really? And the carefully constructed fiction of broke Marcus would collapse, taking with it whatever this fragile thing was that had grown between them. She'd know he'd been lying, know he'd watched her struggle while sitting on a fortune that could solve not just her problems, but the problems of everyone in this waiting room, and barely noticed the dent in his accounts. "Let me help," he said quietly. "I have some money saved, not a lot, but maybe enough to—" "No." Emma's response was immediate and firm. "Absolutely not. You're living in a hostel, Marcus. You're down to your last few dollars. I'm not taking money from you. But if it means your father gets the care he needs—" I said no. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her eyes made him go quiet. "You're a good person for offering. But I've spent my whole life watching my parents refuse handouts, watching them find a way even when there was no way. My mom cleaned houses pregnant with me because they needed the money. My dad worked double shifts for 15 years straight to pay for my art school. We don't take charity, we figure it out." Pride, Marcus thought. The kind of pride that his money had allowed him to forget existed. The kind that kept people struggling when solutions existed. Because accepting those solutions meant accepting a narrative about themselves they couldn't tolerate. He'd always viewed it from the other side, had written checks to scholarship funds and thought himself generous, never really considering what it cost the recipients to accept, what it meant to need help from strangers. "Okay," he said, because what else could he say? But his mind was already working, already trying to find angles and approaches, ways to help without helping. Solutions that wouldn't look like solutions. They sat in silence until visiting hours began. Emma went to see her father, and Marcus waited, scrolling through his borrowed surroundings with new eyes. He noticed things he'd trained himself not to see. The woman arguing with intake about payment plans. The man with an obvious broken arm who kept checking his watch like he was calculating whether he could afford to stay. The whole grinding machinery of a healthcare system that viewed suffering as a series of transactions. When Emma emerged, her eyes were red but dry. "He's sleeping." They gave him something. He looked so small in that bed. She pressed her palms against her eyes. "God, I need air." They walked outside into the November evening. The temperature had dropped, and Emma's breath came out in small clouds. Marcus shrugged off his jacket, the one piece of clothing he'd bought at a thrift store specifically for this experiment in poverty, and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't protest, just pulled it tighter. "Tell me something," Emma said suddenly. "Tell me something true. Something you haven't told anyone in a long time." The request landed like a challenge, like she knew somehow that he'd been feeding her half-truths and carefully edited stories. Marcus thought about all the things he could say, all the confessions he could make. But standing there in the hospital parking lot, watching her try to hold herself together, he chose something real. "I had a panic attack 3 months ago," he said. "Middle of an important meeting, just completely fell apart in front of everyone. I spent 10 minutes in a bathroom stall trying to remember how to breathe, and when I came back out, I had to pretend it never happened. Had to go right back to performing competence for people who needed me to have all the answers." He paused, surprised by how much the admission cost him. "I don't know how to be the person everyone needs me to be anymore. And I don't know who I am when I'm not performing that role." Emma studied him in the sodium light of the parking lot, and Marcus felt exposed, like she could see all the way down to the parts of himself he kept hidden even from his therapist. "That's why you're here," she said. "Not a question, a recognition." "Yeah, that's why I'm here." "Did it work? Did you find what you were looking for?" Marcus looked at her. At this woman whose father was lying in a hospital bed while she worried about money Marcus could provide without thinking twice. This woman who'd shared tacos and poetry and hadn't asked him for anything except honesty. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe I found something I wasn't looking for instead." Emma's phone buzzed, her mother asking for an update. While she talked, Marcus made a decision. He walked a few feet away and did something he'd sworn he wouldn't do. He pulled out the emergency phone he'd hidden in his hostel locker, the one his assistant had insisted he bring. The one he'd promised himself was only for true emergencies. 3 messages from his assistant, 7 from his CFO, 14 from his mother. He ignored all of them and typed out a message to David, his lawyer and oldest friend. "Need a favor. Quietly arrange payment for medical care. Send details. Patient is Robert Torres, County Hospital, Chicago. Cover everything. Make it look like insurance correction or charity fund. Cannot be traced to me. Urgent." The response came back in seconds. "This about the girl you mentioned?" "Marcus, this is getting complicated. Just do it," Marcus typed back. "And David, this stays between us." "Always does," came the reply. Marcus deleted the conversation, turned off the phone, and walked back to Emma, who was ending her call with promises to her mother that everything would be okay. Promises she had no way of keeping. The lie he'd just set in motion sat heavy in his chest, another brick in the wall of deception growing between them. "My mom's coming down," Emma said. "You should go. You've already done so much, and you don't need to be stuck here all night." "I don't mind staying." "I know, but I need some time with my family." Emma managed a small smile. "Thank you, Marcus, for being here, for listening. You didn't have to do any of that." They stood facing each other in the cold, and Marcus felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of them. He wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain that he wasn't who she thought he was, that he could help, that money wasn't just an abstract problem for him, but a tool he wielded with the casual ease of breathing. But the moment was already fragile, already freighted with too much fear and uncertainty, and adding his confession would only shatter it completely. Instead, he said, "I'll check in tomorrow, make sure you're okay." Emma nodded, and Marcus walked away, back toward the bus stop, back toward his hostel and his borrowed life of voluntary poverty. But as he rode the bus through the darkening city, he couldn't stop thinking about the look in Emma's eyes, the exhaustion and determination and pride that wouldn't bend even when bending would solve everything. Back at the hostel, he lay in his bunk and thought about systems, about how the world was designed to work for people like him and against people like Emma, how money accumulated to money, how suffering was distributed along lines that pretended to be random but were actually perfectly predictable. He'd built his fortune by understanding systems, by finding inefficiencies and exploiting them. But he'd never really considered that he was part of a larger system, one that created winners by ensuring there were losers, one that made his wealth possible because people like Emma's father drove buses for 30 years and still couldn't afford a heart attack. The next morning, Marcus woke to a text on his emergency phone. David again. Payment arranged through hospital charitable fund. Shows as insurance coverage correction plus grant assistance. She'll never know it came from you. You're welcome, by the way. Marcus deleted the message and felt something like relief, mixed with something like shame. He'd helped, but dishonestly. He'd solved a problem while deepening the lie, and he knew with perfect clarity that he was creating a situation that could only end badly. Either he'd confess and lose whatever he'd found with Emma, or he'd maintain the fiction and lose himself completely. He spent the day wandering Chicago, trying to clear his head, trying to find some kind of moral clarity in the architecture and the crowds. When he finally texted Emma to check in, her response came back almost immediately. Dad's doing better. Talking to insurance people. Some kind of coverage thing got worked out. I don't totally understand it, but they're saying his costs will be covered. I don't know what happened, but I'm not questioning it. Small miracles, right? Marcus stared at the message. Small miracles. That's what his money looked like from the outside. Random acts of grace instead of the deliberate interventions they actually were. He'd bought her father's health without her knowing, had solved her crisis while maintaining his disguise, and she was grateful to the universe instead of to him. It should have felt good. It felt like ashes. He met her at the diner that evening. Their place now, though neither of them had acknowledged it as such. Emma looked lighter. Some of the crushing weight lifted from her shoulders. She hugged him when he arrived, quick and fierce, and Marcus felt like a fraud accepting it. Thank you for yesterday, she said, for just being there. It helped more than you know. How's your dad? Good. Better. They're doing the procedure tomorrow, and the insurance thing worked out in some weird bureaucratic way I don't understand. My mom lit a candle at church and says it's divine intervention. Emma laughed, and the sound was like light breaking through clouds. Maybe she's right. Maybe the universe decided to cut us a break. Not the universe, Marcus thought. Just a man with more money than sense and less honesty than you deserve. But he smiled and said, I'm glad it worked out. They ordered coffee and pie, falling into the easy conversation that had become their language. Emma told him about a new commission she'd landed. Something bigger. A family portrait that would pay $800. She was excited in a way that broke Marcus's heart. $800, enough to make her eyes light up. An amount he'd spent on appetizers at business dinners without noticing. I've been thinking, Emma said, pushing pie around her plate. About what you said yesterday, about not knowing who you are when you're not performing. I get that. I spent so long being the promising artist, my parents' success story, the scholarship kid who made good. And then the promising part fell away, and I was just struggling, just trying to survive. And I didn't know who that person was, the one who wasn't succeeding anymore. How did you figure it out? I didn't. Not really. I just decided that struggling doesn't define me any more than success did. I'm just Emma, you know. I make art because I have to, because it's how I process the world. Whether anyone pays me for it or not, whether I ever have that studio or not, I'm still an artist. That's not about external validation. It's about who I am when no one's watching. Marcus absorbed this, turned it over in his mind. Who was he when no one was watching? He honestly didn't know anymore. His entire adult life had been about being watched, being evaluated, being the person who delivered results and made smart decisions and turned ideas into billion-dollar companies. Without that audience, without that performance, did he even exist? You're lucky, he said, to know that about yourself. I'm not sure luck has anything to do with it. More like I got stripped down to essentials and had to figure out what was left. Emma looked at him across the table, her gaze level and searching. "What about you, Marcus? Who are you when the performance stops?" And there it was again, that dangerous question, asked in a way that made it impossible to dodge. Marcus felt the truth pressing against his teeth, demanding release. He thought about confessing everything, the money, the lies, the fact that he was performing even now, that their entire relationship was built on a foundation of convenient omissions and strategic honesty. But before he could speak, before he could make the decision that would change everything, Emma's phone rang. She glanced at it, frowned. "Sorry, I should take this, it's the hospital." She stepped outside, and Marcus watched her through the window, watched her face cycle through confusion, then concern, then something he couldn't quite read. When she came back in, she wasn't looking at him. She was looking through him, like he'd become transparent. "That was weird," she said, sitting down slowly. "The billing department. They wanted to confirm some information about the charitable fund that covered my dad's costs. Started asking me questions about whether I'd applied for it, whether I knew who'd recommended him for it." She paused, studying Marcus with an expression he'd never seen before. "They seemed confused that I didn't know anything about it. Said usually these things require an application, a recommendation from someone, but my dad's case just appeared in the system, fully funded, no paperwork trail." Marcus felt his heart start to pound. "That's good though, right? That it got covered?" "Yeah, it's good." But Emma's voice had changed, had taken on a careful quality that felt like doors closing. "It's just strange. My mom was telling me about it earlier, and something felt off. Like the timing was too perfect. Like someone made it happen instead of it just happening." The diner seemed to contract around them, all the air suddenly thin. Marcus opened his mouth, but Emma held up her hand. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Completely honest." She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard now, protective. "Do you know anything about this? About how my father's bills got paid?" Retry TM. The question hung in the air between them like smoke, impossible to wave away. Marcus looked at Emma across the diner table, at the woman who'd shown him kindness when he was pretending to be someone else, who'd shared tacos bought with money she couldn't spare, who'd invited a stranger into her crisis because she believed people should help each other carry their burdens. And he realized that every second he delayed answering was its own form of confession. "Yes," he said finally. The word felt like stepping off a cliff. "I know about it. I arranged it." Emma's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted like a light going out. "How? You're living in a hostel. You said you had almost no money left." "I lied." Marcus felt the full weight of it now, the elaborate fiction collapsing in real time. Not about everything, not about the important things, but about who I am, what I can do. He took a breath. "My name is Marcus Chen. I'm the founder of 3 tech companies. The most recent one sold 2 years ago for just under $3 billion. I came to Chicago because I was having panic attacks, because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be around people who saw me instead of my net worth. So I gave myself 2 weeks to live like I used to, before the money, before everything changed." Emma sat very still, processing. Marcus watched her mind work through the implications, watched her replay every interaction they'd had through this new lens. The coffee he'd carefully counted change for, the burger he'd agonized over ordering, the help he'd accepted at the farmer's market, all of it recontextualized as performance, as lies. $3 billion, she repeated, like the number was a foreign language. "And you've been sitting here letting me buy you tacos, letting me worry about whether you had enough money for food." Her voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if she'd yelled. "Why?" "Because I wanted to know if someone could see me, really see me, without all the other stuff getting in the way." Marcus heard how weak it sounded, how selfish. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be just a person, not a walking opportunity or a problem to be solved. So you solved my problem instead. My father's heart attack became your opportunity to play hero. Emma's hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against the table. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Knowing that while I was terrified, while I was trying to figure out how to keep my family from drowning, you were sitting there with the power to fix everything, and you just watched me struggle because it was more authentic to your experience? No, God, no. Emma, when your father collapsed, I wanted to help immediately. But you said no. You told me about your pride, your family's values. And I knew if I offered money as myself, as who I really am, it would change everything between us. You'd never look at me the same way again. So you did it behind my back instead. You made me think it was random chance, divine intervention, whatever. You took away my agency and replaced it with charity disguised as miracle. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what the worst part is? You made me grateful to the universe. I actually thanked God for something you did. How messed up is that? Marcus wanted to reach across the table, wanted to make her understand, but he knew there was no configuration of words that would fix this. I thought I was helping. You were helping yourself. You wanted to feel good about using your money without actually dealing with the complicated parts, like asking me what I wanted, like respecting my right to make my own choices. Emma stood up, gathering her things. You're just like my ex, actually. Just like every tech bro who thinks the world is broken and only they can fix it. Who thinks having money makes them wise instead of just lucky. That's not fair. Fair? Emma's voice rose, and other diners started looking over. She lowered it again, but the intensity only increased. You lied to me for 2 weeks. You watched me count change and work in laundromats and stress about rent, and you never once thought maybe the kind thing would be honesty. Maybe the respectful thing would be treating me like an adult who could handle the truth instead of a character in your personal redemption arc. I was scared, Marcus said, and felt the truth of it completely. I was scared that if you knew, you'd see me the way everyone else does, as a wallet with a person attached, as someone to use or avoid, but never just know. And for 2 weeks with you, I got to be just Marcus. Just a guy who helps at farmers markets and listens to bad poetry and talks about real things. That meant everything to me. It meant everything to a lie. Emma said quietly. None of it was real, Marcus. You were playing dress-up, and I was the prop that made you feel authentic. And now my father's medical bills are paid by someone who couldn't even be honest about who he was. How am I supposed to accept that? How am I supposed to look him in the eye and tell him his health was charity from a stranger who was pretending to be my friend? The question cut deeper than anything else she'd said, because she was right. Marcus had created an impossible situation. The money was already spent, the bills already paid. Emma couldn't return it without hurting her father, couldn't reject it without consequences that extended beyond her pride. He'd trapped her in his generosity, made her complicit in his deception. I'm sorry, he said, knowing it was inadequate. I'm so sorry, Emma. You're right about all of it. I was selfish and cowardly, and I used you to make myself feel better about a life I can't seem to figure out how to live. But my feelings for you, our conversations, the way I felt when I was with you, that was real. That was the most real thing in my life. Emma closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet. Maybe it felt real to you, but it was built on lies, Marcus, and I don't know how to salvage something from that. I don't know how to trust that any of it meant what I thought it meant. She picked up her bag. My father's alive because of you, and I'll always be grateful for that, even if the method makes me sick. But I can't be around you right now. Maybe not ever. Because every time I'd look at you, I'd remember that you thought I was too fragile or too proud or too something to handle the truth. She walked toward the door, then paused, turning back. You asked me who you are when the performance stops. Here's your answer. You're someone who can't stop performing even when he's trying to. You're so used to controlling narratives and managing outcomes that you forgot how to just be honest and deal with the consequences. That's who you are, Marcus, and until you figure out how to change that, it doesn't matter how many billions you have or how many people you help, you'll always be alone. Then she was gone, and Marcus sat in the diner with cold coffee and half-eaten pie, watching through the window as she disappeared into the Chicago night. Around him, life continued. The waitress refilling cups, couples laughing, a kid spilling juice while his mother cleaned it up with patient efficiency. The world turned, indifferent to his revelation, to his loss. Marcus paid the bill and walked back to his hostel, but he didn't sleep. He lay in his bunk and thought about masks and authenticity, and whether it was possible to ever really know someone when power dynamics were involved. He'd wanted Emma to see him as he used to be, before success complicated everything. But that person didn't exist anymore. You couldn't go back to innocence once you'd tasted power. You couldn't unknow what money could do, couldn't unfeel the way it changed every interaction, every relationship. The next morning, Marcus checked out of the hostel and caught a flight back to San Francisco. Back to his penthouse with views that cost more than Emma's parents' house. Back to meetings and decisions and the comfortable performance of competence he'd perfected over years. His assistant had 100 fires that needed putting out. His board wanted to discuss the next venture. His mother called to ask why he'd disappeared for 2 weeks without telling her. He slipped back into his life like putting on clothes that didn't quite fit anymore. The panic attacks didn't return, but neither did whatever he'd been hoping to find in Chicago. Instead, he had clarity, uncomfortable, unwelcome clarity about who he'd become and what he'd lost along the way. 3 months passed. Marcus threw himself into a new project, something different this time. A foundation that paid medical debts for working families, that covered bills without application processes or recommendation letters, that treated healthcare as a right instead of a transaction. He called it the Torres Foundation, and when his board asked about the name, he just said it honored someone who'd taught him an important lesson. He never tried to contact Emma. She'd been clear about what she needed, and respecting that was perhaps the first truly selfless thing he'd done in their entire relationship. But he thought about her constantly, about paint-stained fingers and poetry readings and what it meant to be seen. Then one evening his assistant brought him an envelope marked personal. Inside was a portrait rendered in graphite with a level of skill that made his breath catch. It was him, but not the version he saw in mirrors or photographs. This Marcus looked younger, more open, caught in a moment of genuine laughter. Below the portrait, a note in Emma's handwriting. You asked who you are when the performance stops. I drew what I saw, the person you were trying to find, the one who existed in the spaces between your lies. He's still in there somewhere. I hope you find him again, for real this time. Marcus hung the portrait in his office where he'd see it every day. A reminder of what he'd found and lost, of the man he'd been for 2 weeks when no one was watching except someone who actually saw him. He never knew if Emma had kept the foundation's money or found a way to return it. He never knew if she forgave him or just decided he wasn't worth the energy of anger. But he knew this. Authenticity wasn't something you could perform, even for an audience of one. It wasn't something you could manufacture by removing money from the equation or pretending to be someone you used to be. It was what happened when you stopped trying to control the narrative and just let yourself be known, completely and terribly, with all the complications and contradictions intact. Years later, Marcus would walk past diners in different cities and think about that night, about the moment before everything fell apart, when anything still seemed possible. He'd wonder if Emma still worked in laundromats, still bought tacos for strangers, still believed in the kind of help that didn't come with strings attached. He'd wonder if she ever thought about him, and if she did, whether she remembered the lies or the moments in between when something real had managed to break through despite his best efforts to complicate it. Because that was the thing about truth. It found its way through eventually, no matter how carefully you constructed the fiction around it. And the question that kept Marcus awake some nights, the one that had no easy answer, wasn't whether Emma had loved him. It was whether the version of him she'd loved had ever really existed at all, or if he'd simply been performing authenticity so well that even he'd been convinced. Maybe that was the real tragedy. Not that he'd lost her, but that he'd lost himself so completely he needed to pretend to be poor to remember what it felt like to be human. Maybe the billions hadn't changed him. Maybe they'd just revealed who he'd been all along, and he'd spent 2 weeks in Chicago running from that truth instead of facing it. The portrait hung in his office, silent witness to 1,000 decisions, 1,000 moments when he had to choose between the easy path and the honest one. Most days, he still chose easy. But some days, when the light hit the graphite just right, he could see the man Emma had drawn staring back at him, asking a question that had no answer. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses the only person who ever really saw him? Retry TM.